My name's Clara Jennings, and if you had met me a few years ago, you might have thought I had it all together. The kind of woman who color codes her pantry, remembers birthdays, and smiles through the pain like she's rehearsed it. But the thing about people like me is, the more put together we look, the more likely there's something we're trying to hide. And for me, that something was my past. I still remember the morning it began unraveling. It was a Sunday, pale light coming through the blinds, that kind of half-awake quiet that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. I was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, when my husband, Aaron, looked up from his phone and asked me a question that made my stomach drop. He said, "Clara, who's Daniel?" And it was like the air got sucked right out of the room. It's funny how a single name can break the surface of everything you've tried so hard to bury. I told him Daniel was just a friend. But he wasn't. Daniel was a man I loved before Aaron. Someone from a part of my life I never wanted to revisit, a version of me I swore I'd left behind. And I lied. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted to protect the fragile world we'd built. The dinners, the laughter, the quiet evenings brushing our teeth side by side. I thought honesty would destroy that. So I lied. But what I didn't realize then was that lies don't disappear. They wait. They sit in the corners of your home, silent and patient, until the day they finally speak for themselves. Aaron and I met in the most ordinary way, a grocery store line on a Friday night. He had this nervous smile like he wasn't used to talking to strangers, and he dropped a bag of apples right at my feet. I laughed. That laugh became a conversation. That conversation became dinner. And a few months later he became the first person who made me believe I could be someone new. You see, when we met I was coming out of a dark chapter. The kind of chapter that doesn't look dark from the outside but feels like it's swallowing you from the inside. I'd been in a toxic relationship for years. I'd lost myself in it, the kind of loss that isn't sudden but slow like erosion. Little by little the woman I used to be just slipped away. When it finally ended, I promised myself I'd never tell anyone what had really happened. I wanted to be reborn, unblemished, untarnished, untouched by all the mistakes I'd made. And Aaron made that easy. He was kind, stable, gentle in all the ways Daniel wasn't. So I created a new story. One where I'd simply had a few bad relationships, nothing more. I didn't mention the restraining order or the night I locked myself in my car shaking, or how my best friend Lily held my hand while I cried until dawn. I left out the scars, emotional and otherwise. I thought I was protecting my future. But what I was really doing was rewriting my past, editing the parts that made me uncomfortable, the parts one didn't want him to see. And I thought I could keep it that way forever. That Sunday morning when he said Daniel's name, my heart dropped because I knew it wasn't a random question. He'd found something. It turns out he'd gone through an old box I kept in the attic. One I'd forgotten was even there. Inside was a stack of letters. Not love letters exactly, but apologies, memories, fragments of a life I didn't want to explain. There was one photo. Me and Daniel at the pier. His arm around me. My eyes red from crying. I remember the way Aaron looked at me then, not angry, not yet. Confused. Why didn't you ever tell me about him? And I didn't have an answer that would make sense. How do you explain to the person you love that the version of you they know was built on silence? I told him it was complicated, that it was painful, that it didn't matter anymore. But pain doesn't expire just because we stop talking about it. And it mattered. It always mattered. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there next to him staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click on every rotation, that soft, mechanical rhythm that started to sound like guilt. You lied. He knows. It's over. By morning he was gone. Not forever, just for a drive, he said. Need some air. But the silence he left behind was heavier than any door slam could have been. I spent that day walking through our house like it belonged to someone else. The coffee cups, the photos, the throw blanket we argued over at Target, they all felt like props from a life that suddenly didn't fit. When he finally came home that evening, his face was different. Not angry. Not even hurt. Just tired. He sat down and said, "Clara, I can forgive your past. But I don't know if I can forgive that you hid it from me." And that's when I realized, it wasn't the truth that broke us. It was the absence of it. I used to think love was about being chosen. That if someone saw all your flaws and stayed anyway, that was enough. But love isn't just about staying. It's about standing beside someone knowing every piece of them. the broken parts, the shameful parts, the ones that still tremble in the dark, and saying, I see you and I still choose you. I never gave Aaron the chance to do that. I took that choice away from him. And once trust cracks like that, no matter how much you try to patch it, the light never hits it the same way again. It's been months since that day, but I can still feel the way the air smelled, like rain and burnt toast, the morning he told me he needed time. He packed a small bag, said he'd stay with his brother for a while. I nodded, pretending to understand, but my chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped something vital out of me. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. So did I. And that's when the real silence began. The kind that hums. The kind that seeps into your bones. The kind that forces you to sit with the version of yourself you've spent years running from. I thought I could keep the past in its place. A closed chapter, sealed and forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It leaks. It stains. And eventually, it reaches the surface no matter how clean you've tried to keep it. That's what I learned, painfully, intimately, the day my husband asked me who Daniel was. Because in that single moment, every lie I'd ever told stopped being words and became consequences. And from that day forward, I started learning what honesty really costs. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles in when the person you love isn't there anymore. Not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of being seen. The first few days after Aaron left, I thought the hardest part would be sleeping alone. It wasn't. It was the mornings. The sunlight creeping through the blinds, hitting only one side of the bed. The way the house smelled different, colder, like something had been unplugged. I kept expecting to hear him in the kitchen, the soft clink of a spoon in his coffee, that low hum he did when he was half awake. But all I heard was the refrigerator buzzing and the faint echo of my own footsteps. I'd walk from room to room like a ghost, touching his jacket, the dent his pillow made, the framed photo on the nightstand of us at Lake Tahoe. We looked so happy there. I was wearing a red scarf. He just told me he loved me for the first time. It was the photo I used for our Christmas card that year. Funny how an image can freeze a moment that's already melting beneath it. A few weeks passed before he called. I'd rehearsed what I'd say to him 1,000 times. Apologies, explanations, half-truths rewritten into something that might sound noble. But when his name finally lit up my phone, I couldn't find a single word. Hey, he said. Just that. Soft. Distant. Like the sound had to travel through miles of something heavier than space. Hey, I whispered back. We talked for a while, small things at first. Work. The dog. Whether I'd been sleeping. It was strange, that dance of familiarity and distance, like talking to a memory that still breathed. Then he said it. Clara, I've been thinking a lot. I don't know if I really know who you are. And it wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was the sound of someone realizing the person they loved might have been a shadow. I wanted to tell him everything then. Every painful, ugly human detail. But where do you start when your history is a tangle of shame? So I said, you do know me, Aaron. You know the me I became. And he said quietly, but I needed to know the you that came before. That line has stayed with me ever since. I spent that night sitting on the bathroom floor, because sometimes that's the only place that feels small enough to hold your pain. The tiles were cold, my reflection in the mirror unrecognizable. I remember tracing the cracks in the grout with my fingertip as if they could somehow map out the cracks in me. When you've built your life around hiding certain truths, you start believing that the version of yourself you present is real. I did. I'd convinced myself I'd earned a clean slate, that if I loved hard enough, worked hard enough, smiled long enough, the old me would fade into myth. But that night, sitting there with mascara bleeding into my palms, I realized something simple and devastating. You can't love someone completely while pretending half of you doesn't exist. Because real love, the kind that survives storms, needs all of you. Even the parts that still bleed. It took me a few days to find the courage to write him. Not a text. Not an email. A letter, ink on paper. Because some things deserve the weight of handwriting, the imperfections of trembling hands and crossed-out words. I told him everything. About Daniel, the way it started sweet and ended cruel. The manipulation, the fear, the guilt that followed me like a shadow. I told him about the years I spent flinching at sudden noises, about the therapy I quit halfway through, about how I learned to smile as armor. I told him how ashamed I was that I'd built our marriage on omissions. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust myself not to fall apart in front of him. When I mailed that letter, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it in the wrong slot. But once it was gone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not relief exactly, but release. I'd finally stopped running. A week later, I got a message from him. Just 5 words. I read it. Thank you. No promises. No forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. But it was enough. It's strange how silence can hurt but also heal. How not knowing can be both punishment and grace. I didn't know if he'd come back. I didn't even know if I wanted him to, not yet. What I wanted was to finally face myself without flinching. So I started to. Every morning I'd wake up early, earlier than I needed to, and sit outside with coffee just breathing. It sounds trivial, but when your life's been built on pretending, stillness feels radical. I stopped wearing makeup for a while. Stopped pretending I was okay when I wasn't. I went back to therapy. I called Lily my old friend, the one who'd been there through everything I tried to forget. She didn't say, "I told you so." He just listened. One night, sitting across from her at a diner that still smelled like burnt bacon and dish soap, I told her everything. Every lie, every fear. And when I finished, she reached across the table, squeezed my hand and said, "You don't have to be perfect to be loved, Clara. You just have to be honest." That sentence cracked something open in me. It's easy to talk about forgiveness when you're the one waiting to receive it. Harder when you realize you need to give it to yourself first. For months, I carried that shame like a second skin. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who'd failed. At honesty, at trust, at love. But somewhere along the way I started to see something else too. Resilience. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The quiet, stubborn kind that grows in the cracks of guilt. I began to write more. Not letters, not excuses, just thoughts. Pages and pages of unfiltered truth. About the girl I used to be, the woman I became, and the one I was still becoming. And slowly I started to feel lighter. Not fixed. Not healed. Just lighter. One evening in late spring, Aaron showed up at the house. I was out back watering the garden, barefoot, wearing a sweatshirt that still had his college logo on it. He stood there for a moment watching me, and I could tell something had changed in him too. He looked older somehow. Not in years, but in the way pain softens people when they stop fighting it. He said, "I didn't come here for closure. I just wanted to see you." And I said, "Do you hate me?" He shook his head. "No. I just wish we could have started with the truth." We stood there for a long time, listening to the crickets, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. It was one of those moments that didn't need fixing. Just existing was enough. Before he left, he said something I still think about. Maybe love isn't about who we were when we met. Maybe it's about who we're brave enough to become after everything falls apart. And then he smiled, a small, tired smile, and got in his car. I watched the taillights fade down the street until they disappeared. After he left, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because for the first time in a long time, I understood that sadness didn't mean brokenness. It meant I was feeling honestly, fully, without filter. And there's something sacred in that. The truth had cost me my marriage. But it had also given me back myself. For years, I'd been performing my own life. Carefully curating who I was allowed to be, what I was allowed to say, which memories were safe to share. But now, I was finally living it. Messy. Imperfect. Ugh. That's the thing about truth. It hurts like hell when it surfaces, but once it's out, it stops being poison. It becomes air. And maybe in its own quiet way, that's the beginning of healing. There's this moment every morning, right before the world wakes up, when everything feels suspended. The air is cool, the sky still undecided about light, and you can almost hear your own heartbeat. That's when I started to heal. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just little by little, in those quiet in-between hours when no one was asking me to be anything. I'd sit by the window with a blanket around my shoulders and watch the streetlights fade. The same street Aaron used to drive down every morning on his way to work. For a long time I expected to see his car again. That silver sedan with the cracked mirror and the coffee stains on the console. I used to imagine he'd pull up, knock on the door, say he was ready to start over. But he never did. And eventually I stopped waiting. The thing about heartbreak, real heartbreak, is that it doesn't arrive with fireworks. It seeps in quietly, showing up in places you don't expect. Like when you realize you've cooked too much pasta because your mind still measures portions for two. Or when you reach for a second towel after a shower. Or when you catch yourself turning to share a thought with someone who isn't there anymore. That's what healing looked like for me. small collisions with absence. At first I tried to fill the silence. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter. Signed up for pottery classes. Joined a book club that mostly talked about everything but books. It wasn't about keeping busy. It was about remembering what it felt like to belong somewhere again. And yet every night when I came home, the loneliness would still be waiting for me. Not sharp but dull, the kind of ache that hums underneath everything. I learned to stop fighting it. Loneliness isn't always an enemy. Sometimes it's the body's way of saying, you're still here. You survived. A few months later I ran into Aaron by accident. It was a Saturday morning at the farmer's market, the kind of small-town place where everyone knows everyone, where the air smells like peaches and coffee grounds. He was there standing by the flower stall. I almost turned around but he saw me first. We talked. About nothing and everything. About how work was going, about how the neighbor's kid had graduated, about how time somehow kept moving forward, even when you're not ready. There was no tension. No bitterness. Just two people who used to share a life, now standing on opposite sides of a river made of memories. He told me he'd started seeing someone new. I smiled genuinely. Not the brittle kind of smile you give to prove you're fine. A real one. Because for the first time I wasn't trying to hold on. I went home that afternoon and sat in the garden. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and damp soil. And I cried, not from sadness, but from the quiet realization that I'd finally let go. Letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without needing it to hurt. That night I opened my old journal, the one I started right after he left, and read through the pages. I saw the versions of myself that had existed along the way, the angry one, the guilty one, the tired one who didn't think she'd ever feel okay again. And then I saw the newer entries. The one where I wrote, I laughed today, really laughed. The one where I said, the garden is blooming again. The one that simply said, I'm still here. And it hit me, healing isn't linear. It's circular. You revisit the same memories, the same aches, but each time they hurt a little less. One morning in late June I went down to the lake by myself. The same lake from the photo Aaron and I took years ago. The pier was empty except for a few ducks drifting near the reeds. The air smelled like wet wood and sunscreen, and the sun glittered across the water like 1,000 tiny mirrors. I stood there thinking about who I used to be, the woman who lied because she was afraid of being unloved. I didn't hate her anymore. That was the biggest shift of all. For so long I'd treated my past like a disease, something to quarantine, to hide. But standing there by the water I realized, it wasn't poison. It was proof. Proof that I had endured. That I had been human. And maybe that's the point of all of this. Not to erase who we were but to learn how to live gently with it. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wish I could go back. To tell the truth sooner. To save the marriage. To keep the life I lost. And I used to think yes. Absolutely yes. But now, I don't know. If I hadn't lost everything, I don't think I would have learned how to finally be honest. Not just with someone else but with myself. Because the truth isn't a weapon. It's a mirror. And it took me years to stop looking away from it. Now I live quietly. I still have the same little house. The same kitchen table. The same chipped mug Aaron used to use. But I've painted the walls a different color. Something warm, something soft. I cook for one but I eat well. I sleep alone but I rest easy. And when I catch my reflection in the window at night, I don't see someone broken anymore. I see someone who survived her own silence. I think about Aaron sometimes, not with longing but with gratitude. He was the mirror that forced me to see what I'd buried. The reason I learned that love without truth isn't really love at all. Last week I got a letter from him. A simple note, nothing heavy. He said he hoped I was doing well, that he still keeps our old Christmas cards in a box somewhere, and that he's glad we once shared a life that was, in his words, real even if it ended messy. I smiled reading that. Because he was right, it was real. All of it. The lies, the love, the heartbreak, the rebuilding. It's all part of the same truth. That night I went outside and sat on the porch, the air buzzing with summer heat and the faint smell of rain. The world was humming. Cicadas, cars in the distance, life moving forward. And I realized something I wish I'd known all those years ago. Peace doesn't come when life looks perfect. It comes when you stop needing it to. I took a deep breath and whispered, I forgive you. I wasn't talking to him. I was talking to myself. And for the first time in a long, long time, I believed it.